On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at CalIT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego.
Well, I think maybe I'll just kick off with a question for you, Norman. I thought it was really interesting where you were discussing the genres that are appropriate for the present moment, and you mentioned that the Picaresque is re-emerging as a rhetorically useful mode for writers today.
Yes.
And I'd love to just hear a little bit more about that idea.
Yeah, it's a strange issue. It's clear that we want something like a novel. It's clear that the games don't provide that. And it's clear that something in the structure of the 19th century novel was about progress and individualism in a way that seems neurotic and inappropriate in this scattershot version of the world that you were describing. Mm-hmm. So I went back trying to figure out first what point of origin would make sense. Mm-hmm. If we're not going to start with the revolutions in the 19th century, late 18th century, why don't we start in the middle of the Baroque? So I start in the middle of the Baroque. And then I found out, yes, the Baroque works. We are sort of Baroque. We do have these overlapping Catholic forms of divine right bullshit oligarchy with insane blurs and religious wars, and on and on and on, and a nation state that's uneasy. So then I tried to figure out what sort of narrative structures did they have, and they liked, from the Spanish to the British, this picaresque form, and it's very episodic. It allows for a lot of data to be sort of thrown in. It always leaves gaps where the character basically says, I don't know, or even the famous line in Tristram Shandy where he said, excuse me, madam, it's obvious to me you haven't been reading properly. So I'm going to have to summarize that chapter reluctantly again for you, right? And it's very much about the character and the audience themselves. And so it was pretty obvious that the picaresque could be nice to play with, and allows for rhythm and yet a tremendous richness. But it also says something about where our politics have gone, our geopolitics too. If that sounds appropriate for an answer.
Well, I think it's interesting that is it in the I can't remember the name of the book, The Geographical Unconscious by Jameson, but where he talks about the conspiracy narrative and the idea that the conspiracy theory becomes rhetorically useful because it sums up the idea that a totalizing understanding of what is occurring in the world is so hard to conceive and so difficult to understand that conspiracy becomes the sort of the useful narrative for that. And so in this case then, I think it's interesting that in a slightly different level of confusion, in fact I might even say in an even greater state of confusion, conspiracy is no longer useful, and the picaresque therefore becomes this kind of an open-ended, almost like a quest narrative that allows you to plug in modular experiences that allow narrative cohesion, but also an explanation of larger political circumstances beyond the narratives or the narrator's limited worldview.
I mentioned conspiracy. One of the characters, his name is Harry Brown. He's the uncle of the chief character, and he erases her identity for her after she gets into some embarrassing problems. She shoots a man, it becomes difficult. And Harry Brown's specialty was that he was hired often by the oligarchs of Los Angeles to erase crimes before they became a problem. And so he's a kind of anti-detective with his own layered version of the 20th century. So I talk to him every so often to ask him advice, and he's available. You know, I can text message him at will, I guess. And then I asked Harry Brown the obvious question, so what's this thing about conspiracy? And then Harry Brown said to me, Norman, I've told you 20 times. Do I have to say it again? I said, I guess so. I think I was in the bathroom when you said it last time. And he said, conspiracies only happen after the fact. It doesn't matter who the few people who murder somebody. What matters is who is there one day afterward completely harvesting the problem. They're the conspiracy. Don't even waste your time with the rest of it. So in that picaresque spirit, you never know who actually causes the conspiracy. You only see the action, shall we say, triangulating and like a pinball machine moving along. And that, I think Harry Browne is more or less right about this. So I've decided I will now no longer look for who shot Kennedy, but what happened a day later. I won't worry about who detonated 9/11. I'll worry about it a day later. And it does make sense. Apparently, it's who plays afterward is the real conspiracy, and that's more in the mood of our 24-hour news cycle way of thinking. We also are not able to get backward anyway. We don't want to know why things happen. 24 hours later, it's old news, right? We don't reconsider as a culture, except you and I. We're exceptions, of course. Well, I don't know if I am. He is.
Well, I don't know about that, but it'd be interesting then in that case, like if the Picaresque is a political neutralization of the narrative process then, in the sense that if you stop asking conspiratorial questions, so to speak, then if you become more interested in the narrative after effects of events as opposed to the workings that led up to them, have you politically neutralized your own investigation as a writer, and therefore you're just sort of detailing a kind of the Picaresque therefore becomes this sort of, this like a eunuch's tale, so to speak.
Yes. I mean, it's about. I have a term that I use in the dismantling of the American psyche. I call it to be inviolate, as in the color violet. I decided I've been looking for it. I can't find the phrase inviolate, so I'm making it up. I officially have found it, right? But it's in Hamlet, the color violet, a lot. Violet is a spectral color, right? When you're in violet, you are indeed being violated. You're in such a state of foreboding that you need a plastic surgery of the present to keep you from facing the future or to ever be older than 30, this kind of thing. And I feel our culture is like that. So, of course, I'm an historian by trade, so I'm obsessed with the root causes of everything. So the truth is, of course, I can't listen to Harry too much. But I do understand why Harry says that. And I do also realize that sometimes looking for the root causes in some conspiratorial way misses the actual, shall we say, moment when it's being turned into something grotesque. So if you see what the Republicans did after 9/11 with regulatory sort of banking systems and all these things, right? Deregulating tax havens even more and so forth. I mean, all this stuff happened. I was reading the paper. Where was my brain? I was looking for the conspiracy when I should have been watching the conspiracy, so to speak. So you can argue both sides, but in our culture, it's just extraordinary how much happens in plain view, right? So I don't know. I mean, maybe people in the audience can tell us what which is the best. I mean, to try to find a real coherent ontological dynamic to explain this new culture is the challenge. I think your work with architecture and geopolitics is incredibly fresh, and I think it goes alongside things like the Center for Land Use Interpretation and other people who are trying to find ways to do this. But I think you're actually using mapping in strange ways, and the whole dynamic, the playful dynamic, and this almost world between fact and fiction, where the fictions actually are facts, is part of your work too. So I think we both are slightly vulnerable to trying to figure out how this sort of marketing of power works. It's tricky because we're used to thinking that one thing is fake and one thing isn't, but it doesn't work that way. So even in terms of conspiracy, it's difficult to understand. But we're in the middle of a gigantic political crisis right now in the United States, and I suppose we could all talk together as to what we think is going to happen, and what's happening right in front of us. There are about 12 different details going on at once. Which is the actual conspiracy? Is this new sex scandal with this congressman? Did someone actually set it up, or does it really matter? Was he dumb enough to have a photo of his cock, bulging in his underwear. Was he that stupid? Does he look? He doesn't look that stupid to me, right? It's just it's a tragic comedy, right? Mm-hmm. But certainly, what's coming after it is very easy to see. Mm. Anyway, are there issues that people have in their projects or in their own scholarship or work that fit into what we are talking about? No.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess to just the first part of the question, that I definitely agree that the Powell map would have also have led to a lot of future geographic and spatial problems that would require a spatial fix, so to speak. But you see a lot of examples of watershed problems. There's a famous example that I've forgotten all of the specific details, but there was a river on the border between the U.S. and Mexico that changed path just slightly enough to effectively move the international border, and there was a sort of a treaty fix to get that back into place. There's another example that's kind of famous between I don't have the details, but I think it's Illinois and Missouri. We're on the Mississippi. There's an island that has moved back and forth between the states because of the way that the Mississippi itself changes in its riverbed. And so this kind of stranded island that's sort of in neither state is another really interesting example of the kind of terrestrial dynamism. And then obviously there are just other examples that I didn't even mention, like the Maldives. I mean, this is slightly different, but the Maldives are actually literally disappearing because of sea level rise and climate change, and so they've been given political refuge in India for basically to sort of flee their island because their nation state is disappearing. So all these kinds of terrestrial shifts and how they impact where people live and where people can live, I think are just totally fascinating. And then that's even when you don't look into much more abstract and strange examples, like if there was say a jet stream map of states where the jet stream performs certain functions for bringing whether it's birds or, for that matter, dust and seeds being spread across the nation in a certain way. But if the jet stream changes, where would the states go? How would they operate, and so on? And so could you have a micronation of jet streams, or could you have a micronation of internal microclimates, et cetera, et cetera? So anyway, all of these kinds of terrestrial fringes, terrestrial borders between one state and the next, I think have really, really interesting political implications. And so, yeah, I could see a similar a kind of Powell map of the Alpine glaciers, where, effectively they assumed that glaciers were so permanent that they could map them as bedrock. And then obviously now we know that isn't the case. So I guess then in the second part of your question about the class itself, so it was in the architecture department. It wasn't and perhaps it maybe even would have benefited from being a geography department course. But basically we took, in the way that all architecture courses basically do, we took sites and we tried to figure out how they could be intervened in by architects. And they weren't really sites so much as three terrestrial examples. The name of the course was Glacier Island Storm, and the glacier example was actually, and this is kind of a long answer, so you can like kick me under the table or something if I go on too long.
I have a comment, but it's a good answer.
Okay.
So.
But so the glacier part was actually looking at artificial glaciers. There's a kind of a vernacular quote-unquote industry in the Himalayas of manufacturing glaciers. This poetically overstates the case a little bit. They're more like ice deposits or snow deposits that last season to season. They're not really glaciers as such. But it's a very architectural process, or at the very least, it's a very geotechnical process. So there's lots of very careful layers of things like gravel, sawdust, gourds filled with water that then burst due to the weight of the ice above them, and then they sort of flash freeze as an adhesive. They're located very specifically on certain sites, so they're on the north side, or even specifically the northeastern facing sides of hills, so that they're in the shade. And they're basically used, they're sort of, they're water banks for the next year in case there's a drought. And so there's a lot of techniques of these, but then there's also a folklore around them. A really interesting myth of these is that villagers actually built an artificial glacier to keep Genghis Khan from invading their valley in the Himalayas. I mean, whether or not that's true, who knows? But the very fact that an artificial glacier shows up in mythology, I think is pretty cool. And so what we tried to do is take the artificial glacier as an architectural event, as a spatial production, and put it into the context of students today. How would they use that? What would it be, et cetera? And so we had a lot of different political scenarios or economic scenarios. For instance, would Los Angeles, if it's running out of fresh water, would it build artificial glaciers in the Rocky Mountains to artificially replenish the Colorado River? And therefore, what would that do to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power? Would it have not sovereignty, of course, but would it have any kind of political authority over land in the state of Colorado? Because after all, Los Angeles already is an archipelago. It has there's a coal burning power plant in Utah, et cetera, et cetera. So this would just simply hydrologicize that, so to speak. But then also, what if Goldman Sachs got into water futures and decided to build artificial glaciers somewhere in Canada and hoard fresh water until it was just the right price and then release it, et cetera. So that was that idea. And then my student, Marissa, went into Switzerland and kind of modeled almost like a border village, like a border surveying village with mobile machines that would scan this shifting boundary and would be used as political tools between governments. And it's almost like a transborder park in the name of glacial preservation and glacial maintenance and glacial production. I won't go into the others because that was already a very long answer. But then the Glacier Island storm, the island was looking at the Okinatori Islands in Japan that I talked about. And then the storm was looking at what was, you might like this example actually, there's a lake in Argentina called Lake Maracaibo, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but there was a permanent lightning storm that has been showed up in ship's logs going back to the 1500s. It's the world's largest natural producer of ozone. And it's a lightning storm that it's constant. It happens every single night. There's a name for it that I've forgotten. But so the idea was to look at the generation of a microclimate. And we looked at everything from the Beijing Olympics, where they were trying to keep it from raining in Beijing. The Moscow mayor said that he was not going to let it snow in Moscow last winter, which obviously didn't work. There's a whole private weather engineering industry in Texas and the Great Plains. And all over the world, et cetera. But so we took the Lake Maracaibo example as an example of, because it's a very specific confluence of geographic features, including rivers, a coastal lake that's just on the ocean, and there's a lot of thermal inversion that creates this lightning storm. Just really briefly, and I'll wrap up this answer, was that I thought it was hilarious that in the process of teaching this class, there was an article saying that the Lake Maracaibo lightning storm had ended. And so it went for 500 years until I taught a class about it. So I guess you get jinxed.
Now,
but anyway,
supposing we take your answer, which is quite a journey through ice, which is of course the obsession of the Romantics, for example, all these novels about ice. And then these microclimates, and then imagine the microclimates as a kind of feudalistic model for culture and power that includes tax havens. I mean, the tax havens are probably more powerful than glaciers. They say something up to 85% of all global business goes to a tax haven, which is a typical problem in our culture, a kind of outlaw secrecy, a kind of casino risk capitalism, which makes these little places, like the Cayman Islands being the famous one, all these extensions of what's left of the British Empire into harbors for trillions of dollars. Companies that don't exist except in safety deposit boxes, and sometimes just mailboxes, and consider them like little glacier subclimates, and how the hedge funders used it, and how Gaddafi used it, and how Mubarak used it, and so forth. So you have this almost Hanseatic oatmeal of little layers of different versions of sovereignty, and in a world like that, the obsession with these glacial transformations, which have happened a little bit before also. I know my father grew up right on the border between two countries that couldn't decide. So every year he went to school in a different language. Until after the 5th grade, he just went to herding goats. Yeah. Gave up.
He went mute.
Yeah. But he was Hungarian, then he was Croatian. He was Hungarian, and he was not Croatian, Slovakian, and it goes Czechoslovakian. And there are all these. There are other cases of borders, being having this weird crisscross. But for us, it has a special meaning. It has something to do with power and vectors of power that are becoming very, very granulated, and yet are extremely dangerous. So somehow the glacier becomes not just a real symbol, but also a kind of active emotional symbol. It's clear that it's going to be very difficult to master plan, right? It's going to be very difficult to deal with a cratered out national system. And the EU, it doesn't seem to be doing that much better. I don't think, especially this year. And it's just unbelievable how much oligarchical, semi-feudalistic, if we use the word feudalism as the word of the day, right? Semi-feudalistic countries are mastering this economy so much more easily. It's very, very ironic and very, very strange. And of course, the computer is all about microclimates, isn't it? Networking and social networking.
Also, literally though, in the sense that your computer is a microclimate because it has to stay cooler than the room around it.
Yeah, wow. So it goes on. So out of all of this, new cultural tropes, new narrative tropes are going to have to develop, and people who are younger than me are going to have to do it. So I give them permission. Right? That's the purpose of what I'm doing. Tell them I said it was okay. This sort of thing. Yes.
I was wondering about, you said that we don't want the future anymore, and then you also
right now in the United States, yes.
Specifically in the United States, and then you said that the future is usually a caricature of the present.
Often.
And so I guess I have two questions. Why specifically don't we want it now, and is it? Do you feel that that's truly different than was ever the case if the future was always a caricature of the present? Like, isn't it always about, to some degree, a kind of control of the guarantee of the present into the future?
Yes. I mean, first, this obsession with future has a lot to do with industrial takeoff after 1870. There's very little of it before. People in 1640 weren't saying, "Wow, think of what 1670 will deliver." It's like no more Black Death. Religious wars will be over. So we have to understand this obsession with the future had a lot to do with the techno-industrial economy, the whole vertical nature of these cities, and the new sovereign states. And of course, the United States sensed, as people do, that they were going to be a net winner, right, in the way that China senses it. And almost all the material we saw, 150,000 images, constantly talking about the United States in ways that were, in a weird way, accurate, right, that it was to be their century. Now, the first clue I had of the other version of what I just said was when Disneyland changed to Tomorrowland. I remember I was asked by the New York Times to talk about what's this new Tomorrowland. So I asked them, because I don't want to go to Disneyland. What they said was that, well, it's now Jules Verne showing the history of tomorrows. And I said, do you have any theories as to why that would be? I said, well, Disney's on the Dow. They don't want to own tomorrow. They'll get sued. It's like not the tomorrow they want to own. It's obvious that the American tomorrow, right, is very dicey, and in many other countries that's not an issue. But for America, which is built on this notion of the frontier for centuries, even imagined as a frontier world before it even was discovered. There are versions of the of America in the 13th and 14th centuries, which is very creepy. I actually see them trying to imagine this other land and then finding it. But so for us, it's really a shock. Yes. And this shock is even more than what will probably happen. It's clear the United States will remain a superpower for the rest of this century. It's also clear that we're being colonized by our own economy, and it's clear that we're losing ground, and it's clear that this entropic process is taking over everything, all our institutions. And so, in that sense, my little shorthand statement was, we're not interested in the future. Something like that. That makes sense.
I would just add, just briefly, like I would use the word "we" in pretty heavy square.
Oh,
square
yeah,
quotes,
I'll put it in quotes. We can put the "we" in quotes. You know.
Because I feel like, I mean, it's a similar. I guess I just feel like the fear of the future comes in different. I mean, it's like if you talk about quote unquote the green economy. Just use one example. A lot of people would be. The reaction to that, especially sort of on the right of the political spectrum, is that this is some sort of assault on everything that we consider American industry, and the U.S. economic viability will be destroyed by the green economy, this, that, and the other thing. But to me, it just seems similar to, a lot of people who own horses 100 years ago saying that the oil economy will destroy the United States because all the people who own horses are going to be put out of business. And all it takes is a little bit of economic imagination to realize that something really huge and amazing could come out of this economic transformation. And so, to me, I feel like in some ways it's almost like a rhetorical or a packaging problem. I feel like if you could package the future in a different way, people would be more interested in seeing it come to pass. Because I feel like otherwise everyone, it's like, I mean, why on earth would you be scared of, hydrogen-driven cars and that kind of thing? But yet people somehow think that that's an attack on the American way of life, not a better version of it. And I think that if we could figure out as writers, designers, architects, theoreticians, academics, teachers, even people working in media and so on, a different way to package these kinds of visions of the future. I do think people actually really intensely do actually have an interest in the future.
I mean, obviously branding and marketing.
Or even especially, I mean, at the risk of like saying something ridiculous, which I do often, is like I feel like the interest in post-apocalypse right now is like a perverse interest in the future. It's people thinking, okay, if this is what it's going to be like. It's like there was my wife and I are on a road trip and we listened to an issue of Radiolab. It was an older issue of Radiolab, which is a podcast, and it was about stress. And that some experiment found that if you know what's coming, you can prepare yourself for it better. And so it's not as stressful and it won't hurt as much. So if someone is about to electroshock you, if you're given a 10-second warning, you can sort of ground yourself and get ready for it. And I feel like that's kind of the interest right now in like the post-apocalypse. It's the interest in like all the kind of zombie horror movies that are coming out. Not because they're going to be zombies, but it's like a preparation for the end of the world.
Well, it's also people who are deeply medicated and have a limited health plan. These people obviously have a fairly limited health plan, so all they can do is be zombies. I mean, they can't get full.
They couldn't get to the hospital.
They can't get talk therapy. They can't.
That'd make a good movie. Talk therapy for zombies.
Yeah.
But I feel like anyway. So I feel like those like interests in catastrophe is its own kind of futurism. It might be dark futurism. Or I don't know what you want to call it, but it is futurism.
I went over the catastrophe theories in the early 20th century, and also went over the car stuff.
Okay.
The obsession were that cars were chasing the horses away. There's an illustration in the project of 1910. Cars were allowed to go more than 5 miles an hour, and they have an image of horses and people falling off the Brooklyn Bridge while the cars are running over them. So there was this torment about speed and the velocity of the car, and then many images of people being forced to inhale, the car exhaust, and just standing there with a puff of smoke above them, and so on and so forth. Now, for the apocalypse thing, it was the British who became obsessed with apocalypse. In 1871, they watched the French lose easily to the Prussians. Then they came up with a book about what if the Prussians took over London the same way. And then the book became very popular. It went through like 13 editions. There was a sub-industry of books until they began to call these books about the Great War. So you have the Great War of 1897, the Great War of 1911, 1907. These books are big, they're popular, they detail things. In 1900, during the South African campaign, the South Africans, having enough gold, buy every artillery that they could imagine, even from the British, and then they catch the British in a kind of a little canyon, and they just fire on them for about a few minutes, and they kill 1,000 soldiers or something instantly. The British are mortified. The photos have passed all around the world, right? And yet, despite all that information, as soon as the war started, they threw flowers at the soldiers. Now, does that mean that if you go to a funeral and then someone says, oh, that's your funeral, then you look in the box and said, it can't be me. I'm standing here. I'm going to Thai food afterward, right? So somehow you feel for a moment immortal, right? Mm-hmm. So is post-apocalyptic logic a way to inoculate yourself into inaction, right? Mm-hmm. Or is it a form of action? I have a feeling it's more the latter, right? Mm-hmm. So the zombies are obviously not going to solve the water problems in California. They're not going to deal with the watershed and build glaciers. Probably up in the mountains in Northern California would be a good place to do them also. But it's interesting to try to figure out what action, right? What generates action, and what generates the illusion of action. That's the challenge for this era too. You know, what a green economy actually has to look like, and how to get to that point of action, you know, because we're specialists in how to pretend we're acting, you know.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And that'll be the challenge for us. I also have another small observation. In my lifetime, the university world was always, and the art world was always standing alongside, watching all the real actors making real political culture. The newspapers, the TV journalists, the this and that, and now suddenly it appears to me that they're looking at a blank spot, like a little puddle of ash, and that the universities and the art schools and so on are the only ones left standing who are getting paid to have an opinion about what political culture can be. They're going to have to stop looking and themselves be post-apocalyptic and actually begin to formulate real action or real agency. So I think in a way the university is used to not having agency, but apparently they better get used to it because they're the only ones left. Journalism is depleted, right? We could go over that whole gloomy scenario, but maybe a moment like this, a day like this, is a reminder that real agency, right, will have to come partly from characters like me, right, allowing characters like you and characters like you to figure out what agency would be. I have a little joke. I call it the 3 Thomas Jeffersons.
Okay.
That there are going to be, in 25 years, 3 Thomas Jeffersons. They're 25 years old, approximately, maybe 30, and they're going to have to fix everything. The system couldn't possibly have 25 more years unless something miraculously fixes it. You know, our national system, our whole, to use the Yiddish word, ungepatcht nothingness, you know, just couldn't have more than 25 years left. And yeah, I know, it's a great word, Yiddish, ungepatcht. It sounds like, oh my God, yeah. That's what it is. It's what it sounds like, that's what it is. And so I assume that every time I give a talk, somewhere in the back, rushing to the bathroom and maybe listening with one ear, is one of the Thomas Jeffersons. So what should I tell her, right? And this is a mission that has to be taken seriously. It's hard for the universities, do you know what I mean? And these institutions of culture get used to the fact that they really are almost like the universities were in Italy in the 20s or in Argentina in the 50s. There are moments where it does matter. So I don't know how that's going to happen. So part of the new glacier building and the new branding has to come not from them, right? It has to come from here more than usual, if that makes sense. And we're not used to it. And I don't know if I'm used to it. But it's going to have to come from institutions that are paid to at least incubate real action.
Yeah. There was a question in the back, but just really quick, just to reply. I think in some ways, though, that one of the things I think is really interesting about this conference and about Benjamin Bratton's work too, or in particular, is focusing on that there still is agency and there still are actors, but they just don't overlap anymore with what we would consider institutions or what we would consider the things like you mentioned, newspaper and media and so on. But I just feel like these things have so radically changed in identity and location and even speed and even composition and and tools, the mechanisms through which they operate, that we don't necessarily, especially in academia, it's easy not to see them operating. And so I think that actually we do live in a state of a kind of like efflorescence, if that's the right word, of agency into different smaller actors and smaller networks. And I think that, I mean, in Benjamin's work, Benjamin Bratton's work, he's pointing out that, and this is obviously a negative example of this, but the terrorists in Mumbai were a very self-empowered network of people using the same technologies that a blogger might use to achieve things through social networking, through global self-location, through Google Maps, et cetera, et cetera. And then also then you get into things that I'm really fascinated by, which are the privatization of things like or rather like the extraction industry and these sort of private micro-sovereignties that exist when people can go into say New Guinea or Western Australia, or for that matter, the Andes, and set up these bizarre fiefdoms. We're talking about feudalism and so on, and it's it's effectively kind of a micro-sovereign location that no one else can enter. It's powered through its own extraction of or transformation of the Earth's surface into abstract capital. And anyway, my point is that these are agents, and also then the other example is the guy from Blackwater who is founding a private military in where is he doing it right now? In Abu Dhabi, I believe. But so, I mean, just these bizarre, shadowy actors that they are real and they do exist. And they you're talking about black sites in the economy, but that money articulates and it condenses and it precipitates in just new forms that we might not be ready for yet. But the thing is, I guess my point then is that academia, I don't think, is the last bastion of action or agency. If anything, I feel like it's totally missed the boat in many ways for a radical
I agree with the mission
shift.
of the boat.
Yeah. And so I feel like there are all these actors out there doing things, and we can't really comprehend them yet.
I understand. It's a bottom-up reality. In other words,
it's almost like an outside-in reality instead of bottom-up. But
we're going to have to remodel. We're going to have to come up with models, and the models may be 300 years old. They might be 50 years old that we work from, but this modeling will help policy and practice and form alliances and coordinate, and that includes how culture operates. I think it could be, I'll put it this way, cultures that have experienced these kinds of shocks, let's say 16th century Spain, right? Mm-hmm. No, 17th century Spain, more likely. 17th century Spain, 16th century Italy, late 19th century France, early 20th century Britain, all talked about memento mori and so forth in this way. And all of them were culturally golden ages. So in a certain way, the opportunity is sensational, but the remodeling is going to have to be very, very considerable. I had about two. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but do you see? I mean, I don't know. Maybe though that within that, I mean, I guess, or a moment of hesitation I might have is that a lot of all the things you mentioned are specifically tied to nation states. And but the thing is, I mean, it's the kind of example like where we say like the apocalypse isn't here yet, but we can get ready for it. But it's not. It is here if you talk to somebody in a totally different economic bracket than we're in. And so, in many ways, we already are living in a kind of Mad Max world. It's just that it isn't in San Diego, California.
No,
or if
agree.
It is, it's in certain neighborhoods of the city. But there are parts of the world that are already undergoing these things that don't tie into nation states. And so my point would be that it just depends on like there are certain entire social classes and groups and other kinds of social formations that would either feel like they're in a golden age, like maybe it's
I'm saying
DJs
that
or something.
I know what I said was a 10% option, but I'd like to hold out for it because of what I do for a living. Right? But I realize, I understand.
But so I just feel like there's a kind of mineralogy of competing optimisms that exists between different groups.
I mean, the fact that I almost come off as an optimist now indicates how paranoid the world is. Because I was always the person that scared people, out of the room.
Yeah.
But I don't anymore as much as I used to. But these kind of micro sovereignties are very, very peculiar, and I don't know how they'll all work out. Another irony is something like this: 2 years ago, right? Or a little more than that, an Iranian student said to me, I know that you're saying it's the end of the political enlightenment as we've understood it. And I get the point. But you have to realize that there's one place where the Western political enlightenment is completely alive in many respects. And he said it's 25-year-olds in Tehran. And then the events in Tehran happened, which triggered a lot of what later became the events in Tunisia. So, and then I would listen to what these people were dying for in Cairo and in Libya, and I realized, shit, that's what was just voted out of Wisconsin last month. So in Wisconsin, they were getting rid of the very things people were dying for in Cairo, right? The language is very strange. So there is a kind of blowback also coming out of this sort of micro politics, or whatever it is. I just want to hope that some of this, right, will generate into what you're talking about, you know, an actual alternative system. But it's pretty clear that it's not likely going to come from the West. But what that is, I don't know. We're at a tipping point. We are, you know, it is after midnight. We did break off the road, and we did slam through a wall of some kind. And it's very strange. Fish don't know they're wet, you know, but they can sense that the water's going somewhere. I think that's more or less where we culturally are. And it makes it difficult to even talk prescriptively about the moment because it's so sudden. But I think year by year, it will become clearer as to how this operates. And that's why I think your work is incredibly interesting, and Benjamin's work. And that's why I'm here, right, to meet people to see what they think. Because I'm fairly certain that almost every year what this kind of conference represents will become more and more common practice. I don't know what that means things are going to be solved. You know, I mean, I'm a basically paranoid, you know, a neurotic person, slightly improved, you know what I mean, over time, you know. So and the news is just so bizarre, right? Yeah. In every direction. In the Maldives Islands, that scene where they were actually holding their final press conference underwater with snorkel equipment. I mean, that was just, everyone was laughing, and you know, and then among some people at the UC system, not here, somewhere else, I mentioned, you know, it's kind of a tragic comedy. I mean, Palin's funny. I mean, de Gaulle wasn't funny. Palin's funny. You know what I mean? And he said, don't say funny. Funny isn't serious enough. It's not serious enough. I said, no, funny is even more serious, because only through humor, right, and some sense of irony can you absorb the information. But they were so paranoid that even the word funny was dangerous. I mean, people are in a very strange state of mind, but at the same time, the potential is just extraordinary. I mean, it's a very, very molten and fascinating moment. And I think we have passed the tipping point. I don't know when you would say the tipping point was. Is it 2000? Is it 1997? I think it's more or less the late 90s, when the really melting effect started, right? Yeah. But it's hard to say. And how much time are we still here? I mean, have we used up everyone's time, or how long are we supposed to do this?
I don't know.
I'm okay. I'm you know.
11:53.
It ends. It probably ends at noon. Is that when it ends?
12:15. I don't know. There was another. Did you
are there other
question
questions?
in the back, or did we?
I mean,
talk over you? That's the next one.
That's the next one. So then I see. I had a feeling we were chatting, right? But anyway, thank you, and please email us if 2 days later, the real answer, right, and the real comeuppance has occurred to you, right? Let us know, because that's the reason why we're here, is to find out things. Thank you. I think that'd be a good time to start.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Oh, and if you want to know about that project, I realized I didn't mention it. There's a website called imaginary20thcentury.com, and then you can, because it's going to be published soon. The project I showed. Yeah, it's quite a bit larger. You know, that was only like a little trailer, I suppose.